tragedy, of course. But the world keeps turning.
Leave him alone. Men don't feel these things the way we do.
I don't understand the reason. Did you have anything to do with this?
So let's start with the biggest question that Season 3 left us with, because I feel like everything else in Season 4 is going to orbit around this one central thing. Why did George leave Bertha? And I don't just mean the surface level answer, I mean the real reason. Because if you watch that finale carefully, something doesn't add up. George was fine at the party. He was present. He was engaged. Things felt like they were moving in a direction, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, everything shifted, and he was gone. No goodbye to Gladys on one of the most important nights of her life. No real conversation with Bertha. Just a complete 180 that felt so abrupt it almost didn't feel like the same character we've been watching for 3 seasons. Now, there's a theory I've been thinking about a lot, and the more I sit with it, the more it actually makes sense to me. You know that trope where a character finds out their life is still in danger, and instead of telling the people they love, they push them away to protect them? They make the separation look real so that whoever is threatening them doesn't go after the family instead. I feel like this might actually be what happened with George. Think about it. We never truly found out who tried to kill him. We thought it was Clay, and that storyline felt like it was wrapping up. But what if George and Larry discovered that the real threat was still out there? What if someone else entirely was behind the attempt on his life, and walking away from Bertha was the only way to keep her and the children safe? I know. It's an annoying trope, because honestly, if George had just sat Bertha down and said, "Look, there is still a serious threat on my life, and we need to make the separation look convincing so they don't come after you and the kids too," Bertha would have understood completely. She is one of the sharpest, most calculating women on this entire show. A death threat? She would have taken that information and turned it into a strategy before George even finished his sentence. But maybe that's exactly why he didn't tell her. Maybe the separation needed to look real enough to fool everyone, including Bertha, because if she knew the truth, her reaction might have given it away. Her grief, her anger, the very real pain we saw on her face, that was all genuine. And maybe that genuine reaction is what George was counting on to make the story believable to whoever was watching. And Season 4 could reveal all of this through a flashback. Julian Fellowes has used that technique before to reframe things we thought we already understood, and I think it would be an incredibly powerful moment if we got a scene that showed us what George actually knew in those final hours before he left. Because right now, the audience is positioned the same way Bertha is. We're hurt, we're confused, and we don't have the full picture. That parallel is not an accident. The writers want us to feel exactly what Bertha is feeling, so that when the truth comes out, if it comes out, the relief or the devastation hits us just as hard as it hits her. But here's where it gets more complicated. Even if this theory is true, even if George left to protect his family, that doesn't mean everything is going to be okay between him and Bertha. Because there's something else going on with George that I think is going to become one of the biggest storylines of Season 4, and it has nothing to do with death threats or conspiracies. It has to do with that small but very deliberate detail the show kept returning to in Season 3. That bottle of laudanum. The painkiller George was prescribed after his shooting. Because if you know anything about laudanum and how it worked in the 1880s, you know that the show just quietly planted the seed for something really dark, and I don't think most people caught it. Laudanum was one of the most addictive substances of the entire 19th century. It was essentially liquid opium, and it was prescribed completely freely for pain management. Men and women across all social classes became dependent on it, and the descent usually happened quietly, privately, in a way that the people around them didn't notice until it was already serious. And George, living alone now, separated from his family, carrying guilt about Gladys, carrying whatever secret drove him to leave, is exactly the kind of person who would reach for that bottle more and more frequently just to get through the day. The show didn't linger on that bottle for nothing. That was intentional. And I think Season 4 is going to show us a George Russell who is not just separated and struggling, but who is genuinely unraveling in a way we have never seen from him before. which makes everything that comes next even more painful to think about. So let's talk about the laudanum situation, because I feel like this is the storyline that is going to redefine George Russell completely in Season 4. And I don't think people are fully prepared for what that could look like. We have spent 3 seasons watching George as this almost untouchable force. He is powerful, calculated, intimidating when he needs to be, and fiercely protective of his family, even when his methods are questionable. He built an empire essentially from his own ambition and sheer will. He is the kind of man who walks into a room and immediately changes the energy of it. And Bertha has always been his equal in that sense. The two of them operating almost like a single machine, each one compensating for what the other lacks. That dynamic is what made them so compelling to watch. So the idea of George Russell coming apart at the seams, slowly and painfully and privately, is genuinely one of the most interesting and heartbreaking directions this show could take. And here is why I think the laudanum storyline is more than just a background detail. The show didn't just mention it once and move on. There was a deliberate focus on that bottle. The camera returned to it in a way that felt intentional, the kind of quiet visual storytelling that period dramas use when they want to plant something in the audience's mind without spelling it out directly. Julian Fellowes has always been a writer who trusts his audience to pick up on details, and I think this was one of those moments where he was essentially telling us, remember this, because it matters. And when you think about the circumstances George is now living in, the addiction angle becomes not just possible, but almost inevitable from a storytelling perspective. Think about where George is emotionally at the start of Season 4. He is living separately from Bertha. He has essentially walked away from his family without giving them a real explanation. He is carrying guilt about Gladys, about the marriage he allowed to happen, about the way he left without even saying goodbye to her on what should have been one of the most important nights of her life. He admitted at the end of Season 3 that letting Bertha convince him to marry Gladys off to a stranger she didn't love made him question his own character. That is not a small thing. That is a man who is looking at himself in the mirror and not recognizing or liking what he sees. And when someone is in that kind of emotional pain, isolated, guilty, questioning everything they thought they knew about themselves, and they have easy access to a highly addictive painkiller that was completely legal and socially acceptable at the time, the math is not complicated. Laudanum addiction in the 1880s looked very different from how we think about addiction today. There was no real public understanding of dependency at that point. People didn't frame it as addiction the way we would now. They called it a habit, or they didn't name it at all. A gentleman taking his prescribed medicine was not something that raised eyebrows in polite society, which means George could be deep into dependency before anyone around him even registers that something is seriously wrong. And that slow, invisible decline is exactly what makes it such rich, dramatic territory. Because by the time the people who love him notice, it might already be at a point where pulling him back is going to require something enormous. Now the question is, how does this addiction actually play out in terms of the story and the relationships around it? And I think there are 2 directions this could go, and both of them are devastating in completely different ways. The first possibility is that the addiction becomes the thing that actually brings George and Bertha back together. Because Bertha, whatever her flaws, whatever the cold and calculating exterior she presents to the world, loves George. That has never been in question. And if she discovers that he is struggling, that he is in genuine danger, I think every wall she has built up since he left comes down immediately. Bertha is at her most compelling when she is fighting for something that truly matters to her, and George has always been that thing. Watching her go to war not against a social rival or a business enemy, but against something as invisible and insidious as addiction, fighting to pull her husband back from something he might not even fully recognize in himself yet. That is the kind of storyline that could give Christine Baranski material that earns her every award the industry has to offer. But the second possibility is darker and honestly more realistic, given the trajectory of where Season 3 left these 2 characters. The addiction could be the thing that pushes them even further apart. Because George, in the grip of laudanum dependency, is not going to be the sharp, controlled, emotionally present man that Bertha has always been able to rely on. He could become erratic,